My son looked me in the eye and said, "You don't belong here." That was my own house. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He said it the way someone says the weather will change later in the day, as if it were information, not judgment. I remember noticing a small crack in the wall behind him, one I had meant to fill years ago, and thinking how strange it was that I was still noticing things like that while he was telling me I no longer had a place to stand. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because my body still knew how to respond politely to my child, even when the words made no sense. The house was quiet after that. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just the normal quiet of a weekday afternoon, the kind I had lived inside for years. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. I stayed where I was, sitting at the edge of the sofa, my hands folded in my lap. I did not ask him what he meant. I did not ask where I was supposed to go. Somewhere in me, a small, careful part already knew this sentence had been rehearsed long before it reached my ears. It had been said before, just not to my face. I had given him this house when my joints first began to stiffen and the stairs started to feel taller than they used to. I remember signing the papers at the dining table because I did not want to go into the office. The pen felt heavy, and he joked about my handwriting getting smaller. I laughed then. I believed laughter was proof of trust. The house did not change that day. The walls did not move. My chair stayed where it always had been. I slept in my room that night and woke up in it the next morning. Ownership, I learned later, does not announce itself. It waits. After the words were said, he went into the kitchen and began opening drawers, looking for something. I could hear the familiar sounds of my life being handled by someone else. He had grown up in this house. I had measured his height against the doorframe. I had stood at that same sink washing dishes while he did homework at the table. None of that came up between us. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say this was hard for him. He asked if I wanted tea, as if we were still inside a normal afternoon. I said no. My mouth felt dry, but I did not want anything from him that required preparation. He poured himself a cup anyway and leaned against the counter, scrolling on his phone. I noticed then how comfortable he looked, how settled. That was when something shifted in me, quietly. Not anger, not fear, just a clear understanding that this moment was not temporary. This was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with the right sentence. This was the shape of things now. I thought of my daughter, not because she was present, but because she was not. She had been the one to suggest the transfer, years ago, framed as practicality. She had said it would be easier for everyone if things were simplified early. I trusted her voice. She sounded like she always had, warm and efficient, concerned about my future. I did not know then how often future is used to mean absence. I did not know that giving something away does not always mean it leaves immediately. Sometimes it stays just long enough for you to forget it was ever yours. When my son finally left the room, I stayed seated. The house felt larger without him in it. Not emptier, just differently proportioned. I stood up slowly and walked down the hallway, touching the wall as I went. I stopped outside my bedroom and looked at the door. Nothing had changed. The handle was the same. The floorboards still creaked near the threshold. It occurred to me that this might be the last time I stood there without permission. The thought was so gentle it almost passed unnoticed. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. I had always believed that if something was taken from you unfairly, you would feel it immediately, like a sharp pain. Instead, it was more like realizing the clock had stopped hours ago and no one had told you. I replayed his sentence over and over, not searching for meaning, just letting it exist. You don't belong here. The words did not describe a place, they described a decision. In the morning, I found the letter on the kitchen table. I did not hear it arrive. It was addressed correctly, my name spelled the way it always had been. The envelope was thin. I opened it without sitting down. The language inside was careful and clean, full of dates and sections and references to statutes I did not recognize. It informed me that I was required to vacate the property within 30 days. It did not mention my son. It did not mention my daughter. It did not mention love or history or the way the afternoon light fell through the living room window at 4 o'clock. I folded the letter once and placed it back on the table. I made myself breakfast, toast, lightly browned. I ate standing up because the chair suddenly felt unfamiliar. When my son came in, he glanced at the paper but did not touch it. He said he had a meeting and would be back late. He asked if I had plans. I said no. That was true. Everything I had thought of as planned had been quietly removed. After he left, I sat down and waited for the feeling everyone talks about, the one that comes when your life changes. It did not arrive. What came instead was a calm so still it was unsettling, like the moment before a long train passes. I looked around the room, at the furniture I had chosen, the photographs I had placed, the small objects that had once proven my presence. None of them spoke on my behalf. The house was already learning how to forget me. I stayed there until the light shifted and the shadows moved across the floor, marking time I no longer controlled. Somewhere outside, the world continued without noticing the small, careful erasure happening inside these walls. I realized then that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a quiet process, one that would not announce itself, one that would require patience. I folded the letter again, more neatly this time, and placed it in my bag, unsure yet of why I was keeping it, only certain that it was not finished with me. The days after the letter arrived moved differently, as if time had decided to walk instead of run. I woke each morning at the same hour, my body still loyal to habits that no longer served a purpose. I made the bed carefully, smoothing the corners, even though no one checked. I washed my cup after breakfast and placed it back in the cabinet where it had always been, noticing how my hand hesitated before opening the door, like it was asking permission. The house did not resist me. That was the hardest part. It allowed me to move through it freely, even as it prepared to close behind me. My son became efficient, not cruel, not unkind, just efficient in the way people are when they believe they are doing something necessary. He spoke to me about schedules and logistics, about boxes and storage units, about how it would be easier if I started sorting through my things early. He did not sit down when he spoke. He stood near the doorway, keys already in his hand. I listened and nodded and said I would manage. I had said those words my whole life. They came easily. My daughter called twice that week. Her voice sounded bright, almost relieved, as if a long conversation had finally ended somewhere else and she was calling from the other side of it. She asked how I was feeling. I said I was fine. She said this was all for the best. She said the house needed updating and that transitions were always uncomfortable at first. I waited for her to say my name the way she used to, slow and careful, like it mattered. She did not. When the call ended, I sat with the phone in my hand long after the screen went dark. I began to notice which objects were truly mine and which ones only felt that way because they had been around so long. The armchair by the window, for example, still held the shape of my body, but it was not listed anywhere as belonging to me. The photographs on the wall were mine only in memory. Even the curtains I had sewn myself were now part of the house, not me. Ownership, I learned, does not care who chose the fabric. There were moments when I thought perhaps this could still be adjusted, softened around the edges, turned into something less final. Those thoughts arrived quietly and left the same way. I did not speak them aloud. I had learned over years of marriage and motherhood that saying something does not guarantee it will be heard. Sometimes silence feels safer, like keeping a fragile object wrapped until you know where to place it. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the doorway of the spare room, the one that had slowly become a place where things were stored instead of used. old linens, boxes of papers, gifts never opened. I pulled out a folder labeled with my handwriting from years ago. Inside were documents I had forgotten I kept, copies of things I had signed, letters from banks, receipts folded carefully. I sat on the floor and went through them one by one, not looking for anything in particular, just reacquainting myself with the shape of my own history. I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough to feel a small, steady alertness settle in me, like a light left on in another room. My son came home late that evening. He asked if I had started packing. I said not yet. He sighed, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. He said time was important. He said the court date was approaching, as if that word belonged to weather or traffic, not to me. I asked him what would happen if I did not leave on time. He paused, then said he hoped it would not come to that. His hope felt distant, like something he had learned to say. At night, I lay in bed and listened to unfamiliar sounds, doors closing softly, footsteps moving with confidence through spaces that had once belonged to my routine. I thought about how quickly roles can reverse without anyone naming it. I had cared for him when he could not feed himself. I had made decisions for him because he did not yet understand consequence. Now decisions were being made for me, and everyone seemed to agree this was reasonable. I began to take walks in the morning, just around the block, not because I needed exercise, but because I needed to feel my body move without permission. The neighborhood looked the same, but I noticed things I had missed before. Small gardens tucked behind fences, the way one house always kept its porch light on during the day. People nodded as they passed. No one knew I was being removed from my own life one step at a time. When I returned from those walks, I noticed my son had started making small changes. A shelf cleared here, a drawer reorganized there, nothing that could be called aggressive, just subtle adjustments, like a house preparing for a new arrangement. I did not comment. I told myself this was temporary, even though I did not believe it. Belief and survival do not always require the same conditions. One evening, I overheard him on the phone, speaking in low tones. He mentioned timelines and compliance. He mentioned that things were moving forward. He did not use my name. He said she instead, as if I were already a case file. I stood in the hallway and listened, not because I wanted to, but because my feet would not move. When the call ended, I returned to my room and closed the door, feeling for the first time like it was no longer a boundary, just a suggestion. I began packing a small bag, slowly, carefully, placing only what I could not imagine leaving behind. Not furniture, not decorations, just documents, a few photographs, clothes that still felt like mine. As I folded each item, I felt something steady growing beneath the quiet sadness. Not hope, not certainty, just awareness, the kind that keeps you upright when everything else is being shifted out from under you. On the last night of that week, I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. The letter lay in front of me again, its edges soft now from handling. I traced them with my finger and thought about how official language can erase years without ever raising its voice. Outside, a train passed in the distance, its sound low and steady. I realized then that whatever was happening had already been decided somewhere far from this room, and that the silence I had been keeping might not protect me much longer. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, slipped under my door as if it were something fragile that needed careful handling. It was thick, cream-colored, my daughter's handwriting on the envelope precise and unfamiliar like she had practiced it. I did not open it right away. I placed it on the dresser and went about my morning, making tea, wiping the counter, standing by the window longer than necessary. The envelope waited. It did not rush me. When I finally opened it, the words inside were cheerful and formal, announcing a celebration, a gathering of family and friends, a moment meant to be shared. There was no mention of me staying there afterward. There was no mention of the letter on the kitchen table. It spoke as if everything were intact. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I sat on the bed and tried to understand what feeling was being asked of me. Pride, perhaps? Gratitude? Relief that I was still being included? I felt none of those things. What I felt was a quiet confusion, like being invited to a house you no longer recognize but are expected to praise. Still, I did not decline. Declining would have required explanation, and explanation had begun to feel like a luxury reserved for other people. My son reacted positively when I mentioned it. He said it would be good for me to get out, to see people. He said it would help things feel normal. I wondered what his definition of normal was now, but I did not ask. I nodded and said I would go. He smiled briefly, the way people do when a task checks itself off their list. In the days leading up to the event, the house grew busier. My daughter came by twice, bringing fabric samples and boxes of decorations. She moved through the rooms with purpose, discussing arrangements with my son as if I were not there. When she did speak to me, her voice softened, became careful, almost tender. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. She told me what time to be ready. She did not ask what I planned to wear. On the morning of the gathering, I chose a simple dress, one I had worn many times before. It fit the way it always had, familiar and unremarkable. I pinned my hair back and looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual, not out of vanity, but out of curiosity. I wondered what people would see when they looked at me now. A mother? A guest? A problem already solved. I put on my shoes slowly, listening to the sounds of preparation outside my room, laughter, movement, music being tested and adjusted. The venue was bright and loud, filled with voices layered over one another. People stood and hugged and spoke in excited tones. When I entered, a few heads turned, then turned away. My daughter spotted me and waved, her smile wide and practiced. She came over and kissed my cheek, her perfume unfamiliar, her arms light around me. She thanked me for coming. The phrasing struck me, not for being there, for coming, as if my presence required effort, not belonging. I found a seat near the back and settled into it, placing my bag at my feet. From there, I watched. I watched my children move confidently through the room, greeting guests, accepting compliments. I watched people I had known for years speak to them about plans and futures, about growth and stability. No one spoke to me about those things. When they spoke to me at all, it was to comment on the weather or ask if I was enjoying myself. I said yes. It was easier than correcting them. At some point, my daughter took the microphone. The room quieted. She spoke about beginnings and support, about gratitude and love. She thanked her husband. She thanked friends. She thanked my son for standing by her. Then she gestured toward me. She said she was grateful for her mother, who had always taught her the importance of letting go when the time was right. The words landed softly, but they did not belong to me. People turned and smiled, and I nodded once, slowly, because that was what was expected. Applause followed. Everyone stood. I stayed seated, not because I could not stand, but because something in me refused to move. I watched as hands came together, as faces lit up with approval. I felt separate from it, like I was watching through glass. The moment passed. The room returned to motion. No one noticed I had not stood. Afterward, people approached me with kind expressions, saying how proud I must be, how generous. I listened and thanked them. Generosity, I realized, is often praised most loudly when it costs the praiser nothing. I excused myself and went outside, standing near the edge of the building where the noise softened. The air was cool. I breathed deeply, counting each breath, steadying myself. When my son joined me, he asked if I was all right. I said yes. He said this was a big day. I said I knew. He hesitated, then told me we would talk soon about next steps. The phrase settled between us, vague and heavy. I asked him when. He said after things calmed down. Things, I noted, never seemed to calm down for me. On the way home, the car was quiet. My daughter talked about how well everything had gone, about how relieved she felt. She did not ask me how I felt. I looked out the window and watched the streets pass, familiar yet distant. When we arrived, the house looked the same as it always had. That steadiness felt almost cruel. That night, I lay awake replaying the applause, the way it had filled the room, the way it had passed over me without touching. I thought about the word let go, how easily it had been used. Letting go implies choice. It implies agency. No one had asked me if I was ready. No one had waited for my answer. The next morning, I found another envelope on the kitchen table. This one was thinner, official. I did not open it right away. I poured myself tea and sat down, my hands resting on the table. Outside, the day began like any other. Inside, I felt the space around me tighten, as if something invisible were drawing closer, patient and exact. I opened the envelope after the tea had gone cold. I noticed that first, the way the surface of the liquid no longer steamed, as if time had waited for me to catch up before moving on without comment. The paper inside was brief. It confirmed dates, referenced compliance, reminded me of obligations already stated elsewhere. There was no accusation in it, no warning, just a quiet insistence that things were progressing as expected. I folded it carefully and placed it beside the first letter, aligning the edges. They looked almost polite sitting there together. My son did not mention it when he came into the kitchen. He poured coffee and checked his phone. I wondered if he already knew what it said. I wondered how many conversations had happened around me without ever including my voice. When he finally looked up, he asked if I had slept well. I said yes. The lie felt small enough to carry. The days that followed were filled with people. Contractors came to measure rooms. Someone discussed repainting the living area. My daughter stopped by with a clipboard and spoke in a low voice to my son, their heads close together. They did not ask me to move. They worked around me, stepping aside when necessary, polite but efficient. I felt like an object that had not yet been relocated, acknowledged only in terms of inconvenience. At one point, a woman I did not recognize asked me which room I would be taking my things from first. The phrasing startled me. I said I wasn't sure. She smiled kindly and said it was always hard at the beginning. I wondered what beginning she meant. I spent more time in my room after that, closing the door not for privacy but for orientation. It was the only space where my things still arranged themselves the way I expected. I opened drawers and looked inside, touching fabric, tracing the edges of photographs. I did not cry. Tears would have required a sense of finality, and nothing felt finished yet. Everything was still in motion, still being decided somewhere beyond me. One afternoon, my daughter came in without knocking. She sat on the edge of the bed and told me she had found a place for me, temporary at first, just until everything settled. She spoke gently, as if soothing a child. She said it was close to amenities, easy to manage. She said I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance. She said she had already spoken to someone about availability. I listened. When she paused, waiting for my response, I asked her if I had a choice. She looked surprised, then thoughtful. She said she thought this would be easiest. Easiest, I realized, is often another word for decided. That evening, my son told me the court date had been finalized. He said it calmly, as if he were informing me of an appointment I had agreed to. I asked him what would happen there. He said it was mostly procedural. He said it wouldn't take long. He said it would help move things forward. I asked him if he would be there. He said yes, of course. I did not ask whose side he would sit on. The night before the date, I did not sleep. I lay still, listening to the house, memorizing its sounds. I traced the cracks in the ceiling with my eyes, the same ones I had noticed years ago. I thought about all the small decisions I had made inside these walls, the meals cooked, the illnesses tended, the arguments softened by time. None of that was recorded anywhere. None of it appeared on paper. The building where the hearing was held was smaller than I expected, quiet, functional. We sat in a room with chairs arranged in neat rows. My daughter and son sat together. I sat alone. When my name was called, I stood and walked forward, my steps measured, my hands steady at my sides. The person behind the desk spoke clearly, reviewing documents, confirming details. I answered when addressed. I did not volunteer anything. No one asked me how it felt. The decision was delivered without ceremony. It acknowledged ownership, compliance, timelines. It confirmed what had already been set in motion. I nodded once because that seemed to be the appropriate response. My daughter touched my arm briefly afterward and said it was almost over. Over, I thought, is another word people use when they mean gone. Outside, the light was harsh. My son suggested lunch. I said I wasn't hungry. He said we should still eat. I declined again. He looked uncomfortable, then said we would talk later. Later had become his favorite word. It stretched endlessly, always just out of reach. Back at the house, things felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because nothing needed to be hidden anymore. The process had been acknowledged. It was official. I sat in the living room and watched as my daughter discussed timelines on the phone. She spoke confidently, efficiently. She sounded like someone who knew where she was going. That night, I packed more deliberately. I sorted documents into folders, separating what felt essential from what could be left behind. As I did, I noticed patterns, names repeating, signatures familiar. I paused occasionally, not to plan, but to understand. There is a difference between those two things, though people often confuse them. When my son came in to check on me, he asked if I needed help. I said no. He lingered, then said he hoped I understood. I looked at him and saw the boy he had been, the man he was now, and the distance between those 2 points. I told him I understood more than he realized. He nodded, perhaps thinking that meant acceptance. After he left, I sat on the bed with the folders beside me and felt something settle into place. Not resolve, not peace, just a steady clarity. I understood now that waiting would not change what had been decided. Silence had bought me time, but time was no longer neutral. It was being used against me. I turned off the light and lay down, listening once more to the house. Somewhere in the walls, something shifted, a quiet settling. I wondered how much longer I would be allowed to hear it from this side. The house began to empty before I did. Drawers stayed open longer than necessary. Cupboards revealed bare shelves. Objects disappeared quietly, not at once, but in a way that made me question my memory. I would reach for something and find the space where it had been instead. No one explained, no one needed to. The logic of the place had shifted, and I was no longer the one it answered to. I moved through the days carefully, conserving energy, observing. I had learned long ago that endurance does not always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like stillness. I stopped correcting small things. I stopped offering opinions. When my daughter spoke about timelines, I listened. When my son mentioned storage, I nodded. My silence was mistaken for resignation. I let them believe that. I began waking earlier, before anyone else. The mornings were the only time the house felt neutral, not leaning toward anyone. I made tea and sat by the window, watching light touch the street. I thought about the difference between being pushed and being prepared. They look similar from the outside. Inside, they are not the same at all. In those early hours, I returned to the documents I had gathered. I did not spread them out dramatically. I read them one at a time, slowly, placing each back where it belonged. I was not searching for revenge. I was searching for accuracy. Dates, names, the order in which things had happened. There is comfort in sequence when everything else feels disordered. I noticed inconsistencies, small ones at first, a signature that appeared twice, once in ink, once in print, a date that did not align with a transfer I remembered clearly, language that assumed consent where none had been recorded. These things did not announce themselves as important. They waited to be noticed. I made no notes. I trusted my memory. It had carried heavier things. My daughter began speaking to me more gently. She brought me brochures, suggested places, described rooms I might like. She talked about independence as if it were a gift she was giving me. I thanked her. Gratitude had become a kind of armor. It deflected questions. It ended conversations quickly. One afternoon, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said she hoped I wasn't angry. I considered the question carefully. Anger requires heat. What I felt was cooler than that. I told her I wasn't angry. She smiled with visible relief. She said she worried about that. She said she wanted us to stay close. Close, I thought, is another word people use without checking its meaning. My son avoided long conversations altogether. When he did speak, it was about logistics. He asked when I planned to move. I said soon. He asked if I had chosen a place. I said not yet. He accepted these answers easily. He had already placed me somewhere in his mind. The details no longer mattered. I began taking my walks later in the day, varying the route. I paid attention to where people went when they needed help. The bank on the corner, the small legal office near the pharmacy, the community center with its quiet bulletin board. I did not go inside, not yet. I was not ready to be seen asking. Observation still felt safer. At night, I slept lightly, not from fear, but from attentiveness. I listened to footsteps, doors, voices drifting through walls. I noted patterns. Who stayed up late, who rose early, who spoke on the phone and when. This was not suspicion, it was orientation. I needed to know where I stood, even if no one had told me. The packing accelerated. Boxes appeared in hallways. Labels were written in my daughter's careful hand. My name appeared on them, abbreviated. I watched as parts of my life were reduced to manageable categories: clothes, books, personal items. The language of efficiency is very tidy. It leaves little room for context. One evening, I found a small box set aside in my room. Inside were things deemed sentimental: a bracelet, a photograph from years ago, a card written in my son's childhood handwriting. I sat on the bed and held each item briefly, then placed it back. Sentiment, I realized, was being returned to me because everything else had been claimed. I did not cry then either. Crying would have made this about loss. What I felt was closer to alignment. Things were becoming clear. Pain does not always need tears to be acknowledged. As the move-out date approached, conversations shifted tone. There was less suggestion, more instruction. My daughter reminded me of deadlines. My son mentioned the importance of cooperation. I said I understood. Understanding had become my most useful word. It disarmed them. It allowed me to continue unexamined. One afternoon, while sorting papers, I found an envelope I had overlooked. Inside was a copy of an older document, one I remembered signing under different circumstances than the version currently being referenced. The language was precise, the conditions were specific. I read it twice, then a third time. I did not feel excitement. I felt steadiness, like recognizing a familiar face in a crowded room. I placed the document back where I had found it and closed the box. There was no urgency. Whatever this meant, it did not need to be rushed. Rushing had gotten me here. Patience, I sensed, would take me somewhere else. That night, my daughter knocked before entering. She asked if I was ready. I said, almost. She stood in the doorway, hesitating. She said she hoped one day I would see this as an act of love. I looked at her and saw someone who had already told herself a story she needed to believe. I told her, perhaps. She seemed satisfied with that. After she left, I turned off the light and lay down fully clothed. I listened to the house one last time, without attachment, without pleading. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, I understood something clearly. They believed this chapter was closing. They believed I was being carried forward by their decisions. They did not yet understand the difference between being moved and choosing when to stand. The last week unfolded quietly, almost politely, as if everyone involved wanted to believe this was an orderly transition rather than a removal. My daughter spoke in reassuring tones, reminding me of dates and arrangements she had already made. My son avoided eye contact more than usual, but he remained attentive to tasks, checking boxes, confirming schedules. They moved around me with care, the way people do when they believe they are being kind. I let them. Kindness, when it is misplaced, still serves a purpose. It keeps people predictable. I reduced my belongings to what would fit into 2 suitcases and 1 small box, not because that was all I owned, but because that was all I chose to carry forward. The rest, I understood, would either be claimed or forgotten. I folded my clothes carefully, smoothing each piece as if it were a small act of closure. I placed documents at the bottom of 1 suitcase, wrapped in fabric, not to hide them, but to keep them intact. Paper is fragile. Truth often arrives that way. I spent time sitting in rooms that would soon no longer be accessible to me, not dramatically, not with longing, just sitting, letting my body remember the scale of things, the way the living room light changed in the afternoon, the sound the floor made near the hallway corner. These details did not belong to me anymore, but they had shaped me. I wanted to acknowledge that quietly, without witnesses. My daughter asked me once if I wanted a small gathering before I left, something informal, a chance to say goodbye properly. I thanked her and said no. Goodbyes are difficult when the ending has already been rehearsed by one side only. She nodded, perhaps relieved. Closure, I had learned, is easier when it does not require listening. I began making small trips outside the house, running errands I had postponed. I visited the pharmacy. I mailed a letter. I stepped into the bank one morning, choosing a time when it was nearly empty. The teller recognized me. She asked how I was doing. I said fine. She smiled and processed my request without comment. The exchange was brief, professional. Still, it grounded me. It reminded me that not every interaction required explanation. Each evening I returned to the house and found it a little less familiar. A piece of furniture moved, a box gone, a decision implemented. I adjusted my path accordingly. I did not comment. My ability to adapt was being mistaken for agreement. I did not correct that misunderstanding. One night I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. I spread out the documents again, not all of them, just enough to orient myself. I did not annotate. I did not mark pages. I read, folded, aligned. I paid attention to margins, to phrasing, to what was stated clearly and what was assumed. I thought about how often assumptions are used to replace consent and how easily they pass when no one objects. I remembered conversations from years ago, small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, a hesitation before a signature, a suggestion phrased as reassurance, a sentence that had been repeated often enough to sound true. Memory is selective, but it is not random. Certain things stay because they are waiting to be understood later. My son knocked softly on the door one evening. He asked if I needed anything for the move. I said no. He lingered, shifting his weight. He said this was harder than he thought it would be. I looked at him and considered what he meant. Harder to arrange, perhaps. Harder to justify. I told him change often feels that way at first. He nodded, accepting that answer easily. After he left, I closed the door and sat on the bed. I felt tired, but not weak. There is a difference. Weakness drains you. Tiredness sharpens your priorities. I slept well that night, the kind of sleep that comes when something inside you has settled into alignment, even if the outcome is still uncertain. The day before the move, my daughter arrived early with a checklist. She reviewed it aloud, confirming items, dates, times. She spoke as if reading from a script she trusted. When she finished, she asked if I had questions. I said no. She smiled and said good. She said it would all go smoothly. I did not disagree. That afternoon, I took one last walk around the neighborhood. I moved slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I passed houses I had watched being built. I passed trees that had grown alongside my children. I did not feel bitterness. What I felt was perspective. Places change ownership all the time. It is people who struggle to release the meaning they attach to them. When I returned, the house was quiet. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, my suitcase beside me, my hand resting on the handle. I was aware that this was the last time I would enter this space as someone expected to leave. That knowledge did not frighten me. It clarified things. I went to my room and closed the suitcase. I placed the small box on top, careful not to crush it. Inside were the documents, the photographs, the pieces of myself that had not been labeled by anyone else. I sat on the bed and waited for evening. At dinner, conversation was minimal. My daughter spoke about traffic. My son mentioned work. I listened. I ate slowly. I thanked them for the meal. The words came easily. Gratitude, when sincere, does not require explanation. Later, as I lay in bed for what I knew would be the last time, I did not replay the past or imagine the future. I focused instead on the present, on the quiet certainty that had been growing beneath everything else. They believed the process was complete. They believed the outcome was settled. I understood something they did not. The story they were telling themselves depended on my continued silence. And silence, I knew now, is not the same as surrender. The morning everything shifted did not announce itself. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no sudden reversal of tone. It arrived the way most important things do, quietly, wrapped in routine. I woke before dawn, dressed carefully, and checked my bag once more before closing it. My daughter was already awake, moving through the kitchen with purpose. She reminded me of the time. I said I knew. My son avoided the room entirely. The car ride was silent. The building we stopped in front of was not the one connected to the move. That seemed to confuse her. She looked at me, then at the address, then back at me again. I told her I needed to take care of something first. She said we were running late. I said it wouldn't take long. There was a firmness in my voice that surprised both of us. She followed me inside. The office was small, orderly, familiar. I had been there once before, years ago, under very different circumstances. The man behind the desk greeted me by name. My daughter stiffened slightly at that. He asked us to sit. I did. She hesitated, then did the same. He placed a folder on the desk between us. It was thicker than the one she carried. He opened it without ceremony. He spoke calmly, professionally, explaining that a review had been completed. He referenced dates, documents, signatures. He explained discrepancies. He used words like conditional and revocable and fiduciary responsibility. I watched my daughter's face as the meaning settled slowly, unevenly. She tried to interrupt. He held up a hand, politely. He said it would be best if he finished. I listened. I had already heard most of it before, in pieces, assembled quietly over weeks. Still, hearing it spoken aloud created a weight I had not anticipated. Not satisfaction, not relief, just confirmation. The house transfer, as it had been executed, did not meet the requirements stated in the original agreement I had signed. Certain conditions had not been fulfilled. Certain assumptions had been made without my consent. The eviction proceedings, therefore, had no standing. The property, legally, had never fully left my control. My daughter stared at the folder as if it had betrayed her. She said there must be a mistake. She said everything had been approved. The man nodded and said approvals depend on accuracy. He slid a document across the desk toward me. It was familiar. I had kept a copy all these years. I placed my hand on it, not possessively, just to steady it. The paper did not tremble. My daughter turned to me then, her voice low. She asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I considered the question carefully. I told her I had been listening. I told her I wanted to understand what she believed to be true before I spoke. She looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as a figure in the background, but as someone who had been paying attention all along. The man continued, explaining next steps. There would be notices issued. The court order would be vacated. Any changes to occupancy would require my explicit approval. He said it gently, as if aware that words like control and authority can feel uncomfortable when they return unexpectedly. He asked if I had questions. I said no. Everything felt very clear. When we left the office, my daughter walked ahead of me, her posture rigid. Outside, she stopped abruptly and turned around. She said she had only been trying to help. She said everything had been approved. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. The street around us continued as usual. Cars passed. Someone laughed nearby. The world did not pause for us. We returned to the house in silence. My son was waiting in the living room. He stood when we entered, searching our faces. My daughter spoke first. Her words came quickly, unevenly, as if trying to outrun something. He listened, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. When he looked at me, I did not look away. I told him calmly what had been clarified. I did not accuse. I did not list grievances. I spoke only of facts, of documents, of standing, of what was now understood to be incorrect. He sat down slowly, as if the room had changed shape around him. He asked why I had waited until now. I told him because timing matters. He did not reply. The boxes in the hallway remained where they were. No one moved them. The checklist lay untouched on the table. My daughter paced briefly, then stopped. She asked what I planned to do now. The question lingered. I told her I would be staying, for now. The word now seemed to unsettle her more than anything else. That afternoon, calls were made, messages left, adjustments discussed. The machinery that had been set in motion reversed itself with surprising ease. It did not argue, it did not protest, it simply responded to correction. Watching it happen, I felt something loosen inside me. Not triumph, but tension I had been carrying without naming. My son approached me later, his voice quieter than I had heard it in months. He said he hadn't known. I told him that might be true. I told him not knowing does not remove responsibility, but it does change the conversation. He nodded, absorbing that slowly.
He said he needed time. I said I understood. Understanding this time was not armor, it was honest.
That evening, the house was silent again, but differently than before. Not emptied, reset. I moved through the rooms without hesitation, touching surfaces that no longer felt provisional. I did not unpack my suitcase. I placed it back in the corner. There was no urgency now. Decisions could wait. In my room, I sat on the bed and closed my eyes. I felt tired in a way that felt earned, the kind of tiredness that follows truth being spoken aloud after a long restraint. I knew this was not an ending. Consequences would follow, relationships would shift, distance would form. But one thing had become undeniable. The story they had been telling about me no longer held. And for the first time since this began, the silence in the house did not feel like erasure. It felt like space. The days that followed did not rush to fill themselves. There were no arguments, no dramatic exits, no slammed doors. Instead, there was a careful quiet, the kind that settles in after something has been corrected but not yet forgiven. My daughter stayed in her room more. My son left early and returned late. The house adjusted again, not with efficiency this time, but with uncertainty. The boxes remained in the hallway for 2 days before anyone touched them. On the third day, my son asked if he should move them back to storage. I told him to leave them where they were for now. He nodded, relieved to have instruction. I understood then how much of this had been driven by momentum rather than intention. Once things begin moving, people rarely stop to ask who they might run over. My daughter spoke to me only when necessary. Her voice was controlled, polite, almost formal. She avoided eye contact, as if afraid I might read something she was not ready to face. I did not press her. Pressing would have turned this into a reckoning, and I did not want one. What I wanted was distance, space for the truth to settle without being shaped by immediate reaction. At night, I slept more deeply than I had in months. The house no longer felt like it was leaning forward, waiting for me to step aside. Still, I did not unpack my suitcase. I left it closed, a reminder to myself that staying was a choice now, not an assumption. Choices feel different in the body. They carry weight, but also balance. One afternoon, my son asked if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where letters had been opened and plans had been discussed without me. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He said he felt caught. He said he had trusted that everything was being handled properly. He said he had not imagined it would come to this. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I believed him. Belief, I had learned, does not require agreement. It requires attention. I told him something else, too. I told him that trust is not inherited. It is built and maintained, and once it is transferred to someone else without question, it can cause harm even when no harm was intended. He looked down at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with his finger. He nodded, but I could see the effort it took. Understanding often arrives before acceptance. My daughter did not ask to speak. When she did speak at all, it was about practical matters. She mentioned appointments she needed to reschedule. She said some people were confused. I told her confusion was understandable. She asked what I planned to do next. I said I was still deciding. That answer unsettled her. She preferred certainty. I had once raised her to seek it. I began spending more time outside the house, not to escape it, but to remind myself that it was not the only place I existed. I took longer walks, I sat on benches, I watched people move through their days with problems I would never know. It was comforting. My situation, once all-consuming, had returned to its proper scale. Inside, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Conversations were shorter. Laughter, when it appeared, felt tentative. No one rearranged furniture anymore. No plans were discussed aloud. The future, which had once been mapped out without my consent, now hovered undefined. That discomfort belonged to them, not me. One evening, my daughter stood in the doorway of my room. She did not come in. She said she felt embarrassed. The word surprised me. Embarrassment implies an audience. I told her there was no audience here, just us. She nodded, then said she had believed she was doing the right thing. I told her many people do. That does not prevent harm. She looked at me then, really looked, and something softened in her expression. Not remorse, recognition. She did not apologize. I did not expect her to. Apologies, when rushed, often serve the speaker more than the listener. She left quietly. I sat on the bed and felt the conversation echo, not painfully, but clearly. We were separating emotionally, not dramatically, but definitively. That separation felt necessary. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a shared space occupied by people moving in different directions. I began making small changes of my own. I reclaimed a drawer. I rearranged a shelf. I moved my chair back to its original place by the window. No one objected. No one commented. The absence of resistance felt almost startling. Still, I knew this arrangement was temporary, not because they would try again, but because I no longer wanted to remain where my presence required constant clarification. Safety and belonging are not the same thing. I had regained one. I was no longer interested in negotiating for the other. One morning, I opened my suitcase and removed a single item, then closed it again. That small act felt like a promise to myself. I did not yet know when I would leave, only that the leaving would be mine to decide. The timing would be guided by readiness, not pressure. The silence in the house continued, but it had changed its quality. It no longer pressed against me. It waited. I moved through it calmly, aware that consequences were still unfolding, relationships still adjusting. Nothing had been resolved neatly. Nothing had been erased. At night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how easily people mistake patience for permission. I had corrected that misunderstanding now. The correction had not been loud, it had not been cruel, it had simply been firm. The story was no longer being written around me. It had slowed, uncertain of its next sentence, and for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty did not frighten me. I did not leave the house suddenly. There was no final argument, no announcement made over breakfast. I stayed for several more weeks, long enough for the air to settle into something neutral, long enough for everyone to understand that what had changed was not temporary. During that time, I moved through the rooms with ease, not reclaiming them, just occupying them without apology. My daughter adjusted by being absent more often. My son became courteous in a way that felt deliberate, as if carefulness could substitute for repair. I accepted that for what it was. I began making arrangements quietly, not secretively, just privately. I visited a small apartment complex near the park where I like to walk. It was modest, clean, manageable. The woman who showed it to me spoke plainly and asked practical questions. She did not ask about my family. I appreciated that. When I signed the lease, my hand was steady. This time I read every line. I told my son first. We stood in the hallway, the boxes still stacked against one wall like artifacts from another life. He looked surprised, then conflicted. He asked if this meant I was angry. I told him no. I told him it meant I was finished explaining myself. He nodded slowly, as if trying to understand a language he had never needed to learn before. He offered to help me move. I thanked him and said I had already arranged it. My daughter found out later, indirectly. She did not come to me about it. When she finally did speak, she said she hoped I would be happier there. The word happier hovered between us, heavy with assumptions. I told her I would be at peace. She looked as if she wanted to argue the difference, then thought better of it. We were no longer having the same conversation. On my last morning in the house, I woke early, as I always had. I made tea and drank it slowly, standing by the window. The street looked the same. The light moved the same way. The house did not react to my leaving. Buildings rarely do. I walked through each room once, not touching anything, just looking. I did not feel sadness. I felt completion.
When the driver arrived, I carried my own suitcase to the door. My son stood nearby, unsure of his role. My daughter stayed in her room. I did not knock. Some goodbyes do not need to be spoken. I paused at the threshold for a moment, then stepped outside. The door closed behind me with a sound so ordinary it felt intentional. The apartment was quiet when I arrived. Sunlight fell across the floor in a way that suggested mornings would be kind there. I unpacked slowly, placing things where they felt right, not where they had always been. I made the bed. I sat down. No one watched. No one commented. The silence belonged to me. In the days that followed, I established routines that required no negotiation. I walked when I wanted. I ate when I was hungry. I slept without listening for footsteps that were not mine. I learned the sounds of the building, the rhythm of the people around me. No one knew my history. I did not offer it. My children called occasionally. The conversations were brief, polite. We spoke about neutral things, weather, health, schedules. There was distance, but it was clean, not sharp. I did not push for closeness. I had learned that closeness offered under obligation often comes at too high a cost.
I spent time reflecting not on what had been taken from me, but on what I had given without being asked and what I would no longer give without care. I understood now that generosity without boundaries can become a kind of erasure. Love does not require disappearance. It never has. One afternoon, sitting on a bench near the park, I watched a woman help her elderly mother adjust a scarf against the wind. The gesture was gentle, attentive. I felt no envy. I felt clarity. That scene belonged to them. My life belonged to me. I did not seek validation for what I had done. I did not need anyone to admit wrongdoing. What mattered was that I had recognized my own authority before it was completely forgotten. That recognition did not come with applause. It came with quiet, with space, with the steady return of self-respect. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the house I had left, not with longing, but with understanding. It had been a chapter, a long one. It had held joy and exhaustion in equal measure. Letting it go this time had been my decision. That difference mattered more than the place itself ever had. I learned that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-betrayal. I had lived too long confusing the two. Now my days were smaller, simpler, and entirely my own. That simplicity felt like freedom. I no longer waited for permission to belong anywhere. I belonged where I stood.